Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Mendelson. I'm the head of Heinz College in DC, and I'm really excited to welcome you to the second session of our speaker series on how ideas become policy, getting stuff done. We're really excited to be joined today by my friend and colleague, Steve Feldstein, who's a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, so part of the Carnegie family of institutions. He's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary from the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department during the Obama administration. And he also served with me at USAID, where he held a leadership position in the policy and learning shop. He's the author of a recently published book. I'm going to lift it up here so everybody can see it. The Rise of Digital Repression, How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance. That's Oxford University Press, 2021. And we're so pleased to have him here today to discuss digital repression and specifically how the Biden administration can respond. I should note also, he has a recently published piece in American Purpose, Can Democracy Survive the Splinter Net? Now, for everybody who's attending, I want to just go over a couple basic Zoom rules. Please, if you can, put yourself on mute. We're getting some background noise from some folks. We welcome you having your cameras on. It's nice to see the happy, shiny faces, but we leave it to you. This will have an interactive part. This is a live conversation. So please feel free to use the chat function. Be thinking of any questions you have, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. And of course, for those of you who are enrolled in the class, you'll be thinking about that end of day paragraph to the book that you will submit. Steve, I can explain offline, but you will remember having written many of these as you funnel it up to the principle of what you were doing on that day. So let's get started about why you wrote this book, which you began in a different, somewhat different political era, although there's some trends that have continued. What led you to write the book?
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, let me just say it's really nice to speak to this audience and to see at least some of you live. It's sometimes I feel like we're all so ensconced within our own little Zoom areas that it's kind of hard to get that interaction. And for me, it's really meaningful to be able to talk through these ideas and hear your feedback. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, and it's particularly nice to be able to do this with Sarah. So thanks for having me. So starting with your first question, what was the motivation for writing this book and how did it kind of come about? So as Sarah mentioned, I was serving up till the bitter end in the Obama administration, so January of 2017. At which point,
at noon, January 20th, at noon.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, I think I took a final picture in like the Ben Franklin room with Secretary Kerry as the boxes were being moved, and which was a very bittersweet, mostly bitter feeling, to be honest. At any rate, so I left the administration, and at that point I had 13 years straight through of public service experience. And most recently, in my last position, I was the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Deputy Assistant Secretary, looking at issues related to Africa, labor, and international religious freedom. So I had a lot of things that I had worked on and I had thought about, but I didn't have a lot of time to actually think more deeply about what they meant. Which is sort of the bane to working in government. You're constantly reacting, you're doing things, but you don't always have a moment to sort of take a step back and say, what does this mean and where are the bigger trends going? So I got that opportunity after the government ended. And, I was kind of casting around for a while in terms of different topics that I thought were important. But a couple of things really struck me when it came to the technology question, which formed the basis for this book. I think first of all, I had sort of seen the arc of different democratic movements, from the color revolutions to, Arab Spring. And then I had also started to see some retrenchment take place when it came to governments using these same technologies, but to repressive effect. And so I would travel around to a number of different places, some of which I talk about in the book, places in sub-Saharan Africa where I was starting to see trends where governments would pick up bloggers, people with online followings, others who were organizers of groups in places like the DRC, the Congo, Ethiopia, Nigeria. And it started to raise a question in my head about what exactly was happening out here. And had we been too optimistic when it came to the liberating effect of technology? Were we seeing a backlash? And if so, how could we best understand that? So that was one of the questions that was really kind of gnawing at me coming out of government. In that I noticed a trend, but I didn't have a really good place in which to contextualize it and better understand what it actually meant. I think a second sort of motivating factor for me was that I increasingly was hearing about repression happening in a systemic way in Xinjiang province in China. And I knew anecdotally or through some different reports that there was a really heavy hand that was occurring when it came to the Chinese authorities and their repression of the Uyghurs. But I started to dig into that a little more. And what I saw became really shocking. And in particular, I think what was surprising to me was the incorporation of new techniques that I hadn't had a very loose understanding about what they were, particularly artificial intelligence and mass surveillance. And yet they were being tested sort of on the ground in real life, in real form by Chinese authorities with devastating consequences. And so I started digging into that issue. I wrote a small piece for National Endowment for Democracy. And that kind of laid the groundwork for a further examination, interest, and exploration about what these trends meant. And so what came from my professional experience, what was born out of my curiosity about a pretty horrific set of circumstances taking place in China, fairly soon morphed into a much bigger project. And then next thing you know, I was looking at global trends and I was picking case studies in countries in which to visit and write about for purposes of this book. And now 4 years later, here we are.
So let me just pick up on a few themes before going to the next question and give some context for those of you who are not steeped in either the colored revolutions or the Arab Spring. I think that you and I both, we in the democracy and human rights space, I think a lot of us thought naively perhaps that early on technology was absolutely an enabling feature for human rights activists, right? So there was, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2005, there was this early sense that Ukraine was really moving forward with its independence. The Arab Spring from Tunisia to Egypt and on, we were at USAID. We thought that Twitter and Facebook were platforms that were really going to enable the transformation. And of course, what we were also seeing simultaneously at that time off technology, off the books, was closing space around civil society. The common theme for us were AID getting kicked out of various places. In fact, AID was kicked out of Moscow or Russia in 2012, October 2012. And this is Lavrov telling Secretary Clinton on September 10, 2012, AID has to be out in 20 days after 20 years, because he thought the response to the Arab Spring in 2011 and his announcement that he was going to become president again, which then using technology spawned protesters in the street. And he blamed Secretary Clinton for this. So the Twitter revolution happened, and then there's this huge backlash. And you're speaking one aspect with the Chinese really using the technology, the party using the technology, but it was happening all over the world. There are dozens and dozens of countries that have adopted hundreds of laws to close civil society space. almost at the same time as this technology has proliferated. And it's part of the larger story of democracy coming under threat and the rise of authoritarianism. So let's talk now about some of the main themes of the book. What do you mean by digital repression? And how did you choose the case studies?
Yeah. So, digital oppression in kind of basic form is the use of, as I define it, use of information and communications technologies for purposes of coercion, intimidation, and harassment against those who would otherwise challenge the state. So if you think about it, it's another set of tools that are now been weaponized or are being exploited by autocratic leaning governments, but they're not always autocracies. Oftentimes they can be places like Brazil or the Philippines that are run by, that are democracies, weak democracies run by authoritarian inclined leaders. And so use of these information tools in particular as a means to accomplish their repressive objectives. So that's the kind of general, definitional framework. In terms of the case studies, it was kind of an interesting thing. I actually wasn't even sure I was going to do case studies initially. And this actually goes back to a point you made earlier about kind of liberation technology, because, the person who coined that term in a well-known Journal of Democracy article was Larry Diamond. And I went to see Larry Diamond very early on in my project. I think after I'd, gotten the proposal accepted, but it was actually trying to figure out what my research design was going to be. I remember sitting down with him and he said to me, look, you can write a piece, a book about technology, but, and it'll be good and it'll be a contribution. But the thing that you can add that's different than what others would bring is that you actually come from a political science, public policy background. You understand better what's happening on the ground. And then you can talk about what technology means for the situation. So why not do country case studies? And so then, I remember kind of coming from that 45-minute hour meeting, sort of like a revelation. I said, wait a second, case studies that makes perfect sense. Why not? So that's how I got to case studies, really born out of that conversation. So then it was a question of, there's many different ways to slice and dice how you do these things. You could do 3 similar cases and you try to look for variances and use those to make generalizations. You could keep it different, but within a region, or you could have more heterogeneity. And so I used a combination of wanting to have diversity in my case studies and also recognizing that there was, a limitation to how much I could travel and do things. So, I ended up picking, so one reason I knew for sure that I wanted to have would be Southeast Asia because of the influence of China, which is one of my big questions in the book, and the fact that there's so much happening in the digital front there. And so Thailand, was a natural place where you have kind of a classic authoritarian country, lots of interesting things happening, big amount of Chinese influence, and a place where, it was also kind of in the, a lot of upheaval was occurring. So that was interesting. So I picked Thailand. The Philippines, to me, was then an interesting counterpart in that it has a democratic tradition. Duterte, the head of state there, is very well known at this point for being illiberal. The type of tactics that they're using, as I kind of knew superficially, were digitally oriented, but they were more on the disinformation side and not on the classic surveillance or censorship side. So I wanted to do a kind of comparison. I thought that would be interesting on that end. And then my own regional background, the place where I know things the most is sub-Saharan Africa. And so I knew I wanted to do something very different. Also, so I could sort of showcase and see where are there commonalities between what's happening in Southeast Asia and in another region, where there also is competing Chinese influence and where there is a lot of dynamism in terms of movements. And so I was really debating between Ethiopia and Kenya as the 2 places. And I chose Ethiopia because there was an opening. Abiy, the prime minister, was very exciting. And I thought that, you could really kind of showcase, in contrast to the other 2, a place where things were liberalizing. So I did the Ethiopia case study last year in February, 2 weeks before things shut down because of the pandemic, and a few months before civil war struck in Tigray. And now, there's obviously been a lot of change. I think what's in the book has sort of maintained its currency, but I wasn't able to predict how bad the situation politically in Ethiopia would go, and just how disappointing Prime Minister Abiy would end up. So that's kind of a long way of answering your sort of short question, but that's kind of how I landed on the case studies.
So this is mostly about state behavior and how states are using the technology. But what did you find was most surprising from the research? And people must ask you this all the time. Do you consider yourself a techno optimist, a techno pessimist, or neither?
Yeah. Well, I think a few things were sort of interesting. So first of all, it is mostly about state behavior, but really states operate with a constellation of different partners, many of whom are sort of quasi civil society. Some of them, I mean, they're not all government civil society groups. I mean, a lot of them have an agenda that happens to align with the government's agenda. So if you look at Thailand, for example, you have monarchists who genuinely believe that pursuing lèse-majesté censorship laws is the right course of action to protect the monarchy. And so to that extent, there's a kind of a confluence, a convergence between what the state is doing in terms of its own repressive agenda and what other outside groups will also propagate. But you're right. I mean, overall, I did want to look at the motivations and incentives for state behavior, because despite the fact that we are in a new environment where some would argue governments matter less, I still think that they matter incredibly much, and that in some ways we're seeing the resurgence of the power of governments. If you look at where we see the most kind of threats coming from an authoritarian lens, I mean, look at the state power of China and how they're reining in the tech industry there. Look at what's happening in Russia ahead of elections and how they're systematically reining in online expression also. And in a host of other countries, whether it's India or Nigeria. I think one of the themes that we're starting to see is this sort of revenge of governments in a very big way against private sector actors that increasingly are under pressure to conform to national regulations. So that's why I kind of focus on the state side. But in terms of both what was surprising and then talking a little bit about kind of the civil society side a little more, what was surprising to me is that I thought when I approached this that we would see a pretty classic example of authoritarian governments using and supplementing their political survival strategies with digital techniques. So I wasn't surprised to see a China or Russia or Thailand or Saudi Arabia, use surveillance and so forth. What I was surprised was to see just how much this had bled into and spilled over into democracies, particularly weak democracies. And so one aspect of that, which is really interesting, is just the fact that many countries like Brazil, the Philippines, and so forth, have a host of sophisticated strategies that they're using to pretty damning effect. And frankly, their means is less about surveillance and much more about Facebook, a US platform. So that really kind of upends our whole understanding of Facebook. Second of all, a lot of companies based in democracies are really active in this whole game of digital repression, much more so than I anticipated. So I thought when I sat down with intelligence officials in Thailand, they would tell me, yes, we're working with the Chinese because they can provide the equipment, they don't ask questions. And to some degree, they did say that. But they also said, look who are some of our most aggressive partners. The Israelis are constantly selling us different things and giving us flagging when they have new equipment we think might be interesting on the surveillance side. The Americans, the Europeans are also extremely active when it comes to selling this equipment. And they said, you all are so obsessed with thinking about China. They said, China is one actor, but there's many other people there that we work with. And frankly, why would we want to put all our eggs in the basket of China? Wouldn't we want to hedge who we work with anyway in order to protect ourselves? And that really resonated. I remember that conversation, very vividly. And I saw similar echoes of that in the other countries I visited as well. And so, to me, that issue was also extremely surprising, that far be it from just being a China driving digital repression question, it was much more of many different actors with their own agendas engaged in a push-pull dynamic with countries and with governments having their own agendas in terms of how they want to kind of push these ideas.
So a couple themes to pick up on. One, part of what's happening is sovereignty in some ways is eroded, right? Because the internet is transnational. So if you are a Russian activist or an Ethiopian activist, you can be talking with whoever, enabled by the internet. And if you're a repressive state, you want to be able to control those borders. So I'm wondering if you see, I mean, I see the backlash in part a result of a kind of a rise of hyper sovereignty, an attempt in the 21st century to reestablish the rules of sovereignty. But I also see, and this comes up in the book and in your conversation, there are different market dynamics also, right? So you've just described Thailand diversifying. They have a diverse market to choose from, right? But I know from my study of Russia that what basically happens is if you're an entrepreneur and you create Kontakte or whatever, a Facebook-like platform, it can't remain independent. The state eventually comes and takes it over. So there's a securitization of anybody who's involved in anything tech and internet related, which goes back, decades to the Soviet Union. It seems to be somewhat similar in China. But then there's this other kind of in between thing where you're a state like Thailand and you're diversifying. It's not all about, the state dominating the private sector that creates tech stuff. And then we have a completely other model, which I want to get to in a second. These huge companies, which we're not regulating, and that are out there competing with these other markets and other companies. You want to comment on that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say I very strongly agree with your your proposition that we are seeing an emerging greater level of sovereignty assert itself in contrast against whether you want to call it the liberal international order or other kinds of sort of transnational dynamics. And what's interesting is that we would expect that with China and Russia, particularly as we see sort of the reemergence of strategic competition or great power competition, between sort of two or three of the kind of largest countries in the world. But like look at what's happening in Turkey, or look at Nigeria, or look at India, right? Countries that are not quite in the top tier when it comes to geopolitical power, and yet there you also see the same designs to establish sovereignty against companies that would seem to challenge it, or to just establish their own rules against kind of the idea of a free, open, interoperable, reliable internet. And so this is proliferating around the world. But whether it's a norm that China and Russia have now set, which have kind of given a permissive structure for weaker countries to then follow and say, well, if they're going to wield cyber sovereignty ideas, we can do so too. And guess what? It actually is favorable to our own authoritarian ideas, or our own leadership ideas, to follow along that route. So I do think that that's a big trend taking place without any question.
Can I put one little amendment though? There's the cyber sovereignty, but then there's also the use of cyber to invade other countries' space, obviously, right? There's, hybrid action using technology, which, I think some people regard as a form of warfare. Certainly interference in other countries' elections for very low cost, right? I mean, and proliferating, around the world and certainly in this country.
Yeah, that's right. No, I mean that's a kind of a whole other area which I didn't explore much in the book, but which certainly is one that we're thinking a lot about, whether it's for economic warfare reasons, geopolitical reasons, or reasons to disrupt democracy. Again, because of perceived threats that democracy poses to authoritarian systems. And so that's the Russians. The Chinese are increasingly using disinformation techniques, against the U.S. and other places, certainly Taiwan. You're seeing that happen kind of across the board. And it's this idea, part of it also relates to the fact that we haven't really established rules of the road when it comes to what is the threshold for hostilities and what isn't. when it comes to sort of cyber norms, right? So when you attack and take offline an electrical grid, is that an act of war? Well, if you drop the bomb, certainly it would be. But for some reason, cyber attacks haven't hit that threshold. So countries can get away with it, and they will, until told otherwise, until the norm dictates that if you do X, you will get such a repercussion Y, therefore it changes behavior. So behavior is all over the place, but it's very aggressive at the moment in the cyber realm.
Let's return to that in a second, the sort of international norms and attempts at regulation. And I think there's what do they call it? The Tallinn norms. There's a group that has sort of come out around this. But let's talk about the Biden administration for a second. In this recent piece, you talk about the splinter net. What is that exactly, and what can be done about it? And let me push you a little bit on the administration's willingness to tackle basic policy reforms when it comes to internet governance. So it's a lot of different things. Let's start with the splinter net.
Right. Well, so the splinter net, is essentially what we've been talking about. It's the idea that if you had at one point maybe one or two different modalities for how internet governance occurs, right? So one which is much more of an information security authoritarian one, where surveillance and censorship aspects are viewed as entitlements that the state has and that they can use when they need to restrict or regulate online content. You have the other side, which is kind of the free, open, interoperable internet propagated by liberal democracies. And for the most part, that idea of a free and open internet was one that was widely accepted around the world. And in some respects, and it still is, I think, the dominant model. But it's one where there's a lot of fraying that's occurring as democracies and other countries are increasingly devising rules to restrict content, block social media, take the internet offline when they need to. And so the more this is happening, the more we're seeing this fragmentation or splintering of internet governance that's having really negative effects when it comes to human rights and political freedoms around the world. So that's the splinter net. And then, so then the question is, in terms of what kind of policies can the U.S. put forward, and how does that link to, reforming internet governance? And, I think there are areas where the U.S. with liberal democracies can do, can have some beneficial outcomes. So one of the things that came out of the G7 gathering in June was this, kind of decent statement on internet shutdowns. Essentially saying, all signees, and this included India, stand together and condemn internet shutdowns, or at least, kind of illegal government internet shutdowns. So that, that's the kind of thing that on kind of a minimal level can do some good. But I think there are much bigger questions when it comes to user privacy, when it comes to the spread of disinformation balanced against free expression, that have yet to be addressed in any meaningful way. And so a lot of people will look at the Biden administration and say, A, are you willing to take the charge of the hard decisions at home? Are you willing to restrict companies when it comes to exploiting user data? What about your own surveillance practices, especially when it comes to online activity like social media surveillance? Are you willing to rein in your own law enforcement agencies? Will you put these rules in place? And the answer so far is maybe a little bit. We'll see, but it hasn't been particularly impressive. And so if the US isn't willing yet to sort of take these hard steps at home, what credibility do they have abroad to push an alliance and a group of like-minded countries together to push forward these protections? And the answer is middling.
Can I push you a little bit on that? What's your analysis of why there's either so much ambivalence, or, and this is not, I would say, the only policy area where, the magic 8-ball, answer cloudy, ask later, but do you have an analysis? One possibility is we haven't yet built what we need to actually address it. Are these agencies, do they have the skills and capabilities? Do they have the individuals that have the skills and capabilities to advocate certain rules? And And here I would also point to the EU. I mean, like, how far behind are we from the EU?
Yeah. I would point to two issues that prevent the US from making progress. So I think one is political polarization, particularly in light of the Trump administration and their policies, what they did when it comes to disinformation. We've completely broken down consensus about what we should do about basic laws like Section 230, which gives a blanket intermediate liability protection to Facebook or Twitter to not be held responsible for the content on their platforms. Things like that. We can't find common ground because it's become so hyper politicized when it comes to tech platforms. That's problem one. And so, you're then reduced to either having one party jam through reforms, which isn't a great basis for a law, or to have an executive order come about, which at some point may actually happen. So that's one problem. The second problem is I think we have an economic issue, which is that, we have a tradition of laissez-faire economics where essentially, the government plays a hands-off role when it comes to how companies operate, or you sort of take a hands-off role initially, allow innovation to flourish, and then come in behind later on and say, okay, now that we see all the harm that can result, we're going to regulate you. And so that ethos, even if it's starting to chip away a little bit, I think makes a lot of legislators reluctant to step in too aggressively to constrain platforms. And so, as a result, I think others are taking the lead. And I think the EU, for example, has done some really admirable things when it comes to the Digital Service and Digital Markets Acts, GDPR, other sorts of things that they've kind of put in place. They're not perfect, but they are experimenting. They're laying down the groundwork for real change. And so what's happening then is that platforms are responding to the Europeans and they're shaping what the regulations look like while the US is out to lunch. And I don't think that's a great way for things to occur. At the same time, I'm really grateful the Europeans are willing to do something when we are not.
So do we have any missing personalities or missing leadership positions? I mean, should there be, like, how would this, thinking back as a counterterrorism model, right? We put in place a counterterrorism team that liaised at the State Department with European colleagues. Where does this sit in the State Department to do that?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I mean, there's a bureau that sort of focuses more on cyber. That was it was sort of established in the waning days of the Trump administration. It's unclear if it's actually a bureau or not, if they're going to nominate someone to lead it. So that's one problem. But I would say, let's just ask the basic question, right? Let's just sort of say, who is responsible for tech policy internationally, and how would they link to whoever is responsible for tech policy domestically in the US, so you can have a unified approach? And I don't know the answer to either one of those questions, right? So first, in the State Department, I couldn't tell you who's on first and who's responsible for tech policy there, right? I know who does like the economic side. I know who thinks about the democracy, human rights side, or who does the side, but who is who's the accountable person? No one. And then on the domestic side, it's the same problem. I mean, there's lots of smart people who are in different areas of what we're talking about, but why not have one person accountable for the broad array of tech policy, from disinformation to surveillance, that can sort of be the figurehead who brings it together. And again, those are missing. And I think, leadership does start from that aspect. So I think that's challenging.
That's your next article. Do it, go for it. And actually feeding into this, I mean, there are a lot of us who spent a lot of time focused on this upcoming Summit for Democracy. And what I think is going to actually end up being more than one summit, right? It'll be virtual in December, but then there'll be a reconvening. How does any of this or all of it relate to that? What would you want to see come out of that going into it? We were part of a task force where there was a big focus on, with Eileen Donahoe and Vera Zakheim, on the role of technology and both countering authoritarianism, but things that we need to do to get our own house in order.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's funny.
Let me put it this way. What would be the deliverables that you'd want to see coming out of that summit?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with the summit. I mean, I would say just as a framing, I think people are a little bit divided in terms of whether this is sort of a exercise that's necessary to do that won't lead to much, or whether it is an opportunity that can sort of change, some of the conversations that are out there. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Whether it's just sort of an exercise where a lot of countries come together, but you have a diluted form, or whether you can actually have meaningful progress. But I would hope for a couple of things. So one would be that digital issues rise to the forefront of what's on the agenda for the Summit for Democracies, because they are such an essential piece to how we think about protecting political freedoms that we can't sort of put it to the sidelines. It has to be mainstream as a kind of core pillar of what's discussed. So one would be just the elevation of that, I think, would be important. I think second would be, establishing sort of a set of minimum and necessary norms when it comes to everything from internet shutdowns, to surveillance, requirements, to other kind of safeguards when it comes to user data, things like that, where you could set kind of goals for where the different democracies want to come out. You have a year then to kind of monitor, implement, and then you come back in your live summit a year later and you say, how did we do? I mean, you actually have a kind of an accountability forcing mechanism for that. So if you match the kind of normative side to the concrete, tangible side by laying out specific objectives for where you would want to see progress, and then you have a way to kind of measure that and review it a year later, to me, that would be a win.
I think that's an excellent way of framing what ought to happen, and the accountability piece in particular. Let me ask you one question before going to, in this case, Zoe's question. Part of me wonders if there's some generational thing going on here as well. I've just come out of 2 days of meetings on the Sustainable Development Goals that Brookings and Rockefeller convened on Zoom, of course, the 17 rooms exercise. And this also follows from the Secretary General releasing his report, Our Common Agenda. And in both those conversations, there was a lot of focus on the need to make sure and partner with the next generation, that youth are really absolutely critical to so many of the issues that we're dealing with, whether it's the climate crisis. But here I feel like people over a certain age, which I will include myself, perhaps not you, we're at a disadvantage, and I do worry a little bit that that is true, but much of the senior levels of government, I mean, including at the most senior level, are filled with people who are not tech savvy, who are not fluent in the way that the next generation is, and that involving the next generation in solving this range of really thorny policy issues is going to be really critical, but I don't necessarily see it happening yet. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's improved, to be honest. I mean, I certainly remember, there's famous hearings with Facebook and Google from maybe 8 or 10 years ago, where like one of the senators asked, Mark Zuckerberg, well, how does Facebook make money if you don't charge people for using the service? He said, we sell ads, Senator. So if that's maybe the low point of kind of the senior core of lawmakers, I think we've gotten better. And the reason I would say that is that certainly dictators and autocrats who are older, I mean, look at people like Putin, right? Or Modi, right? Or Duterte. These are not young men. These are aged senior lawmakers who have managed to either surround themselves with tech savvy implementers and or dictate strategy at a high level to weaponize this stuff. And so if you can weaponize it, right, if you can exploit and use it for your agenda, then democracies also should have an ability to think about more virtuous regulations in terms of how you manage the ill effects and promote the beneficial effects as well. Like, it shouldn't just be a one-way street, that if you're old and a dictator, you're fine, but if you're older and in democracy, you're out to lunch. It should be equivalent, you would hope.
Well, but the Putin example is a really telling one, and I'll tell you why. Prior to 2011, Putin didn't think social media made any difference. there was a huge jump or break after seeing the Arab awakening, and it only intensified around the Maidan, the Dignity Revolution in 2014. But really, after 2011 happens, I've just told you about the USA being kicked out. He's got this complete thing about Hillary Clinton. He starts to invest in 2013 and 2014 in these tech tools for bad, if you will. But the way he does it, it's not like he's sitting there. He delegates this, right? He securitizes it, and it is young people who are the foot soldiers in this. So I feel like I worry that we don't have enough, but maybe you're saying we do. There's not enough of a tech core inside government agencies that are able to, advance tech for good, I guess is what I'm saying. I want to see much more of this.
I think it's happening. I mean, if I wonder, for example, and I'd be curious to hear reactions to this, is whether the January insurrection in some ways is the wake-up call that democracies need, at least in the United States, to sort of say, wait a second, social media is real. The kind of conspiracy theories that we kind of put left into a corner, QAnon and all sorts of other sort of things, stop the steal. This isn't just a fringe element. This is a fringe element, perhaps, that has a large following, that has co-opted a plurality of people who are marching on a Capitol and translating this into physical action. And that if we don't take this seriously and we continue to put our head in the sand in terms of what actually social media can affect when it comes to politics, we're going to lose our democracy before our eyes. And I certainly, among the people that Sarah and I that we know, I think there's been a lot more seriousness since January, and a lot of those people are in government now. So you hope that combined with a cohort of younger people who have the technical chops to do something about this big problem, that we can get some action.
Many of whom are with us today. I will say, I think law enforcement did take it seriously. I think intelligence has increasingly taken it seriously. So the question is, let's talk about disinformation. And this is something we'll be hashing through in the class. Do you have how much have you thought about ways to combat disinformation within the US, especially domestic ones? I mean, we're just talking about, the conspiracy stuff rather than the overseas ones. I mean, there's a lot of homegrown stuff, right? We don't need to necessarily, with the Russians do is they will take grievances or this disinformation and amplify it, but a lot of it is homegrown. What's your sense about this?
Yeah, I have done a lot of thinking on that. And frankly, I very much agree with the premise of the question, that if you were to ask me what I think is the biggest existential threat to our democracy, it's not outside interference, it's domestically originated disinformation. It is Trump and his cohorts, and it's Fox News and Newsmax and Tucker Carlson and that whole constellation, that conservative ecosystem that's threatening the pillars of democracy. So what do you do about it? Well, I have no great answers to like what is maybe going to be the dominant question of our time. But what I would say is one of the things I've looked into is that I think it is too simple and too easy to strictly pin the problem and the culpability on social media. One of what a lot of research is showing these days is that there's a much more complex interaction between the mainstream media ecosystem, particularly on the conservative side, and how you have a pinging back and forth between platforms and messages, between your Sean Hannitys, your Tucker Carlsons, and a host of others, and how those messages come out. So one of the things we will have to do is to think about this more holistically, to not simply say, how do we stop disinformation from spreading on Facebook? I mean, that is way too narrow of a question for us to answer. Instead, we have to sort of say, how do we stop illiberal, anti-democratic messaging occurring in a very broad ecosystem that has captured wide swaths of the population and refuses to accept basic tenets of truth, objectivity, or even our past elections. And until you can solve that bigger question, you're not going to solve the more discrete question that derives from that, disinformation, because they're inseparable.
So what you're really saying is the Facebook issue is just symptomatic of this much larger set of issues, which to my mind, again, somewhat on a generational perspective, this is about education in schools, right? This is about literacy, media literacy, the truth, fact, uh, and being objective, and the importance of, on some level, maybe it's civic education, and bringing that back. But it is very much, I think you're right, linked to the overall erosion of democratic norms, and how people feel about democracy.
Yeah. And I just wonder with digital literacy, when you think of digital literacy in one sense, it's sort of like, how do you use the internet and what is social media? I mean, it's sort of basic, but what we're talking about is a worldview that it has taken a very dangerous illiberal turn, right? So it's not just digital literacy, it's civics, but a much deeper form of grappling with logic, and traditions from the Enlightenment, and a liberal arts education, and and so they're very structural. And so then I do agree. Ultimately, the key is figuring out a way via education to cultivate a more enlightened mindset. But I don't quite know how to get there yet.
Well, I think lots of people have to weigh in and be helping on this. Um, we're open to anybody also putting in questions in the chat function. I wanted to go back to two things, one we've touched on and one we haven't. On the one we've touched on, the Section 230, and where do you come down? Do you think there's got to be reform of that is a way, to help regulate this, and that there needs to be sort of advocacy campaigning around that? And then the other is about predictive policing algorithms, and sort of what you see. And I see we have another question, but why don't you take a quick run at those two?
Yeah. No. Well, so on Section 230, I certainly think we need a revisiting right now in terms of the kind of blanket protections that platforms give. I think, frankly, they have run away or run forward and done a lot of things that are irresponsible because they've been able to get away with it. Whether it's being late in the game when it comes to tamping down disinformation, or particularly using algorithms to promote divisive viewpoints, polarizing viewpoints, because it leads to clickbait and revenue generation. There needs to be a rebalancing. I think where people are iffy is, how do you best solve that? Some of the European models, like Germany's NetzDG law, go too far in the other direction, where there's such an onus on platforms to take down anything that would, go against very iffy hate speech laws, that you get this over compliance problem. You essentially take down anything that remotely smells or looks like it could be controversial, and so that's censorship in another name. So we got to find a way to hit a middle ground. I think issues that link to pushing more transparency and accountability, particularly when it comes to algorithms and amplification, are probably the areas where there's the most, I think, utility in terms of pushing for reform. But the bottom line is that we do have to do something. Right now, the system is very dangerous and threatening when it comes to our democracy. Do you want me to move to the predictive policing question, or what exactly? Let's see here. I'm trying to see.
With new concepts like decentralization introduced to tech, do you, I guess, think this will help solve the problem or make it worse? What are some notable trends in tech that will play a bigger role?
Yeah, I guess my question is, what exactly are we talking about when it comes to decentralization? I guess my question, sort of back to Frank, is what exactly are you referring to? Because I've been seeing a lot of centralization as well as decentralization, right? We're sort of seeing both, in a sense that as you see law enforcement consolidate information, as you're seeing, the whole idea between artificial intelligence and predictive policing is that you're accessing and centralizing different silos of information as a way to put together a complete picture of an individual, based on everything from financial records to phone calls to location monitoring and so forth. So I would argue actually that where we're going when it comes to the efforts that China is doing, where we're going when it comes to surveillance and law enforcement, and the use of predictive policing algorithms is actually to consolidating this information stream in a way that we haven't seen before. Now, there are other ways that people are kind of pushing back when it comes to decentralization. So, the idea of, having apps that are kind of, like more encrypted, you have smaller groups that are less kind of public. I think there's a lot of good and some also negative outcomes that can come from that. But also ultimately, I think that if you sort of see where that will go, it'll hopefully provide for a greater amount of privacy and maybe having reclaiming a little bit of our lives from what's otherwise out there online.
So here is a question from John that's extremely important. To what extent is the problem of disinformation an issue of governmental legitimacy and social grievance, and I would add lack of trust? And do you think inequality plays a role in making a country more susceptible to disinformation or misinformation? And you take a hit at it, I'll take a hit at it.
Sure. So I'll be brief. I generally, yes, I would say I believe that there is a very strong link between social cohesion and disinformation. And I believe that social cohesion itself is premised on a society where there is political and economic equality as sort of core pillars. So I think where you would see better efforts that have been undertaken in some of the different Scandinavian and Nordic countries are places that also have relatively better approaches when it comes to social cohesion. So I think this is a very superficial answer, but on a basic level, yes, I think there is very much a link between social cohesion and levels of conspiracy, propaganda, and so forth that come out.
I mean, in part, this is about to the extent that there are deep inequalities and there are grievances that have not been addressed, that is the territory or fertile ground in which disinformation can take hold, right? So again, it's not somebody out there making stuff up. These things are real. And so part of the answer, there are non-tech answers to some of the tech symptoms or problems that we see. And I think too often we get siloed and there's a tech on tech conversation, but it leaves out the political and social aspects.
I very much agree with that. I think, in fact, I think you can't disaggregate them. At this point, we have to sort of think of them and their interactions in combination. But to sort of simply look at it as this is a tech problem and this is a social science issue does a disservice to both.
I think that there's some governments that understand that perhaps better than we do, that they're used to exploiting those kinds of grievances. And that leaves us particularly vulnerable. But it's just not, it's not how we've necessarily thought of security being important to our national security, and I think it really is. Ultimately, the reduction of inequality in this country and making sure that governments, local, state, national, deliver for people is going to be, really critically important for the future of this country. So we're almost out of time. I noticed, I think you dodged my techno-optimist, techno-pessimist question. I'm guessing from most of your answers that you're somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I'll take that on. No, I have actually been thinking about that a little bit. You're right. I mean, I am somewhere in the middle. I mean, I don't think that we can just, look at technology and innovation and say, forget it. I mean, that's impossible. And so to do that would be sort of consigning yourself to, a very difficult and sad, sort of perspective. On the other hand, I am not of the belief either that we're kind of completely better off because we have social media and smartphones. And I think about that even through the eyes of my own children, because, do I want either of them at their young ages, to have smartphones, to be on screens, or, just seeing the ill effects of social media, of Instagram, where there's been new studies showing heightened levels of anxiety and depression as a result of use of that among other, of that platform. No, I don't think that's great. And I think that for a long time, I excused all the negative outcomes and negative externalities from these platforms under the kind of idea, the altar of free expression. Well, even if they do X or Y, even if people can manipulate them, at least it allows new forms of expression to take place. And I think we have to challenge that, particularly those of us who are in human rights and democracy. We have to challenge that a little more, because I don't think that's enough. I don't think we can just sort of say marketplace of ideas, it's a good, therefore, let's move on. I think we have to ask, is it always the best case that we have these types of platforms, and how do you measure the particular good and bad? And are we looking at trends where we see the swamping of good information to such profound levels online that maybe rethinking in a broader way how the structure of expression works online is necessary. So I think we have to ask some tough questions, and I don't think we can simply just rely upon our kind of past understandings of how information was protected as sufficient for where we're going when it comes to the internet and online communication.
Steve, this book is extremely meaty. This conversation is very nuanced. This is really, I would say, the nexus of incredibly difficult policy questions that have to be puzzled through and are really. I mean, I'm even more convinced that the Summit for Democracy has to have an important element that we've discussed, and to date, I think it's been missing. I think there are people who are pushing for it. I'm assuming that you're in the mix also, talking to our colleagues who are putting this together. And so we'll see what happens. But I feel like 2021 is the year, along with 2022. It's got to happen. And I'm really glad that there are colleagues like you who are working on this. And for those of you who are students listening, a lot of times the good ideas for policy come from outside government, and then they find champions inside government and they take on life. And so I'm hoping that that happens for some of your ideas, Steve.
Well, thank you. That's really generous of you, and I appreciate this opportunity to talk.
Thank you so much. Join us next week when same time, same place. We're going to be joined by a former colleague from the Justice Department, Maha Jaweed, talking about leveraging international engagement to advance justice at home, reflections on what works. And this is a very much moving target inside the Biden administration, so it should be a great conversation. All right, everybody, take care, stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you all. Thanks, Sarah. Bye.